I'd like to start this by just letting you get to know folks. I know you have their bios, but we've asked them to just say a few words. Samir, who are you? What does software mean to you? But and also, what's that trend?
This is a flashback to when I was at the GSB, thinking about that first cold call in the class, right? So,
yeah.
Here's my name card, by the way. My name is Samir Gandhi. I'm a partner at Sequoia Capital, a venture capital firm down on Sand Hill Road. We're a early stage venture fund working on our 11th partnership. So we've been around for a while and seen a lot of the ups and downs of the valley, and I've had the good fortune to be involved in some pretty interesting companies. My background is, before Sequoia, was investment banking and also sales in a software company, a little-known company when I joined it, but one today that probably everybody knows, a company called Oracle, which I worked for in the 80s. I also took time off in between those two different jobs to spend 2 years here at the GSB and graduated in 1994. And my undergrad background was in EE, which I fled immediately to join the software business. So I have an affinity for it, and I'd say maybe the one thing that led me in that direction was when I was at MIT working on a EE degree, this personal computer called the Macintosh came out, which was sort of a revolutionary experience for people that were, in and around technology at the time. And I thought I would start a company to write software for the Macintosh, which I did, with 3 of my classmates. And, this was while we were undergrad, so we had a nice little run at it and made a little bit of money, but it sort of got me in the software business, and I caught the software bug from there. So the one thing you can write on the board, I think, for me is that I'm glad we expanded the definition of the panel, by the way, because I wasn't going to talk much about enterprise software today. I think the next 18 months is not about enterprise software. It's about software elsewhere, and I'm very interested in the consumer and the small business marketplaces and what software could mean for those.
My name is Shukla. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called RubiconSoft. This is my second software startup. The first one was called Rubric. So I've got a 20-year career in Silicon Valley, started out in a semiconductor company when that was a very exciting market, and apparently that's back as well, and moved over to Unix databases, Unix database software, 4GL tools, and then moving up the food chain, so to speak, application software. The company I started in '97 was called Rubric. It was one of the few companies at that time pitching enterprise marketing automation, in particular using the internet to interact with your potential consumers and fueling the whole e-commerce drive. And this company was funded by some of the Silicon Valley VCs, and we sold it in 2000 after raising about $13 million and having a great ride, having $8-9 million in revenue. We sold it to a company called Broadbase for $360 million in February of 2000. And so, in hindsight, I would say that the one thing that we're really proud of is our timing. So after taking a little bit of time off to investigate what else is going on in the Valley, I came back to software and started a new company which is in stealth mode, again funded by a group of friends and of Silicon Valley Sand Hill VC, Lightspeed Venture Partners, and this is in a new area, and it's a stealth mode, but it's in the area of demand performance management. So I'll explain what that means. Of course, as far as the trend that I see, maybe because I'm in the trenches every day, in enterprise software, you can write that on the board. I mean, I see this whole area of demand, whether it's demand-driven enterprise, whether it's pricing, whether it's compliance, whether it's visibility. The whole area of demand being an area that I think that Fortune 2,000 companies and small and medium businesses are really going to focus on this area, while they've been focused on cutting costs and optimizing their operations for the last 2 to 3 years.
Terrific. Thank you. Jonathan.
Hi, my name's Jonathan Abrams. I'm the founder of a company called Friendster, which is a leading enterprise software company. My background really is as a hardcore computer geek. I began coding in BASIC and machine language on 8-bit computers in the early 80s, Commodore, Apple, and Atari, if anybody remembers back in those days. And before my entrepreneurial career, my career was pretty much as a software engineer. Some of the companies that I worked at was back in where I grew up in Canada. Started off at Nortel, writing telephone switching software, which was a entirely different discipline than most of what goes on in Silicon Valley. That's a 100-year-old telephony industry with ISO 9001 and just quite a different ballpark from what I encountered when I moved down here to work for Netscape, working on internet software. Which was pretty much the opposite of the spectrum in terms of maturity and process and everything. So, and I've worked at a couple startups, so a lot of different experiences in various types of software, including some enterprise software. And part of, I think, the way that Friendster got started was after a couple of stints of where I was doing mostly management. I was actually curious, amongst other things, to see if I could still even remember how to code. And that was, I think, one of the things that led to the creation of this, little website project that came to be Friendster. In terms of my take on trends, I think the two things that I see are, one is cost, and the other is connectedness. And I guess I can go into more on those later.
My name is Larry Augustin. I'm a Stanford graduate as well. PhD in electrical engineering here, so my training and background is actually in software. I did a fair amount of programming. I have, I think it's down to 2 lines of code in the Linux kernel. It's kind of my claim to fame. I spent some time at Bell Labs as well. In 1995, I founded VA Linux, took that company public in '99, grew that company up to about a $220 million run rate, and then got hit by the dot-com downturn. Most of our customers went out of business. Turned that company from a hardware company, Linux systems company, into an enterprise software company. Left there about a year and a half ago, and am now in the venture capital business. I'm a partner at Azure Capital Partners, an early-stage venture firm up in San Francisco. So I've been involved in software for a long time. I, started out programming. Still like to see if I can write something now and then myself. Although as you move into management, you just lose those brain cells that let you do real work. So it's tough.
I'm looking for more software engineers.
Looking for software engineers.
Yeah.
What do you guys use?
Java, PHP, Linux.
Java,
We use
PHP,
Linux. Yeah.
Linux.
You could do an internship.
PHP is a little. It looks like I found a job here.
Yeah.
That's good. Good. It's always useful coming here and finding a job.
It's good networking.
It is. It is. I know a couple good networking. Never mind. Big trends. You want sound bites?
Yes, I do.
I think that, and I don't know what the right word for it, but I'll say that I've seen a major trend in the way people develop software and a big change. And what I want to say is that I think monolithic programming is dead. And what I mean by that is when I was trained as a software engineer, the goal when we were writing things was we were thinking about what's called scaling up. That is, how can I make this program run on a bigger multiprocessor machine faster, right? All of the things you need to run on a big multiprocessor. And today, what I see people is looking at scale out. The first thing a software architect thinks today is, how can I make this thing run on 1,000 really cheap servers that I bought down at Weird Stuff? And I think that signifies a major change in the way we think about developing software, the tools we need, and the environments and all of the components that fit around enterprise software.
Except for a short stint as a cocktail waitress when I was in undergraduate school, I spent my entire career in software. I started a software company after a year as a systems programmer at the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis. I started a small company called Open Systems the same year Microsoft started. So I was able to be part of the original group Grope set in software. I think I met Tom shortly after that when we were wandering around blindfolded in the dark trying to figure out what software was and how to actually price it. We took some detours. We tried to shrink wrap software. Just one quick story there. None of us knew what a shrink wrap machine was. My company was in Minneapolis, so we were fortunate that the frozen pizza company down the street went out of business, so we had the only software that had a cheese odor to it when shipped to the customer. At Lotus, they used to shrink wrap the lead programmer before they shipped their product and then quickly unwrap him before he suffocated.
That's right.
But so we had a lot more fun in software figuring things out. It's a lot more competitive now. In 1989, John Hummer and I, John's a graduate of Stanford. I'm a graduate of the University of St. Thomas, which is near St. Croix, but that would be the St. Croix River in Minnesota. And to be the first venture capital firm focused 100% on software. It took us 113 meetings to raise $35 million for our first fund. We're on our fifth fund now, which is a $420 million fund, because people thought software was a bad investing area because the assets walked out the door at night. Fortunately, we did get the firm funded. We funded about 90 software companies since that time, and are very active A-round investors right now. I think we're closing 3 A-round investments this month alone. So one thing both Samir and I have commented on, that A-round investors are very active right now funding new companies. As far as trends in software, I think that there are a lot of commonalities across the consumer segment and the enterprise segment right now. One is that the power has returned to the individual advocate. That's the consumer in the consumer market, and that's the individual worker in corporations. And the driver for a lot of this innovation, both in the consumer segment and in the enterprise segment, I would call communication and collaboration. For the consumer, it means omnipresence, interactivity across devices, personalization. For the enterprise, it means more and more business value is moving to the communications level. It has to be more managed, it has to be more secure, it has to be enterprise, and it's touching a whole new level of the software stack, including voice over IP, that's brand new, uncharted territory, wide open for entrepreneurs. So my trend for both consumer and enterprise is communication and collaboration.
Let's start with you. Let's go with you.
Well, the trouble is,
Davos. It was all these panels at Davos, and what's going on in that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I seem to have no end of panels and such discussions about open source going on now, and to some degree, I think that's a sign that that it's less interesting. To me, that means that it's become more pervasive. It's become more common. Everybody is using Linux and open source. It's just not a new thing. It's moved into that stage where I don't know, in the venture space, whenever we look at a company, we start asking them, okay, so how are you building this? What are you using? And most of the companies are building something off of some piece of open source. And that can come from, well, yes, we're using Linux underneath, or, we're an internet service and we build out on Linux because it's cheaper, easier to use, et cetera. I think you guys do a lot of Linux work, right? Certainly Google is an example of that. And that's an example of it's just another component we use as well, all the way up to people looking at where these things fit in the software stack. And one of the things I like to emphasize, and I'm one of the people who helped create the term open source and have been involved there for a long time, but from the point of view of this audience in business and entrepreneurs, what I want to emphasize to people is that open source is just another tool that you can use. And you have to look out there at all the tools you can use in building your business, figure out what your business is, who your customer is, what the business model is, and then look at open source as a great way to do things cheaper, better, faster around that. And there are many ways that you can do that. One of the mistakes I see a lot of companies doing, it's amazing how many people still do it, is they like to reinvent stuff. App servers for a long time was one of my favorite examples. I mean, how many enterprise software companies still had their own app server components in the software stack. It makes no sense. There's a perfectly good free one available, JBoss. Use it. Don't reinvent there, right? So as you look at these things, I guess a piece of advice I have is understand where your value is. Make sure you're investing where your value is, and where it doesn't matter. I mean, no customer's going to ask you, they don't really care how you do things underneath. Use things like open source underneath. It makes a lot of sense. So there's a few words.
Yeah, so why don't we stick on that for a little bit, and rather than the format of biting your tongue. So does anybody have anything to say about open source? I think you do, because we were chatting about it before.
Yeah, I think open source is a really interesting topic to discuss, but I think it's part of a set of topics that all belong together. First of all, for the individual developer or small sets of developers, and we frequently are funding a small engineering team that has gone out and found a hole in the market and found a customer need. It allows young engineering teams to have higher quality tools for a much lower price right at the starting line. Many of those tools are replaced over time by other things they have to pay a lot more money for. But this really isn't about free. It is really about changes, especially in the enterprise area. Not only is open source one of the big changers, but what's called on-demand computing. That's changing the pricing model dramatically for software. And all of this is pretty startling to the incumbents. If you're an enterprise software company, whether you're Microsoft, Oracle, PeopleSoft, or SAP, you've had a pretty well-defined pricing model that you'd like to keep. Utility computing, which allows people to rent products, open source, which allows them to mix and match components that are available at a more fair price, is changing the pricing model dramatically. Also, the demands of customers right now, as we went through this recession where enterprise purchasers really had very limited budgets, they've gone back to requiring real time, meaning that in less than a year you have to demonstrate that the pricing of your product can deliver lower total cost of ownership, or TCO, or some return on investment in a defined time period that is real numbers. That is changing the pricing dynamics in software. And open source thrown into that milieu is creating turmoil for the incumbents. That is great for entrepreneurs. It's great for companies at the starting point. Most of the open source companies that are getting funded, like JBoss that just got funded, or MySQL, are hybrid companies. They're not giving away software. They're charging a bunch of money for their software. But their Trojan horse strategy is, let me give you some tools free, and I'm confident as a software provider that you're going to want to keep those tools, and thus you're going to be willing to pay me money for the other incremental services, the incremental components, and I can get out of the Trojan horse and be inside a castle.
Ann, you said something there that I almost think should be on that board back there, the way I think of it. And I think of that the traditional enterprise software pricing model is fundamentally broken. Right?
Okay.
It's coming under. It's coming. And what you said is it's coming under a lot of pressure right now from open source, from the need to show TCO in less than a year, from on-demand autonomic computing. Right? So people are changing those pricing models, and I think a lot of customers have gotten fed up with sort of the traditional big enterprise pricing models, enterprise software models that people have had, and that's driving a lot of it. So I think that that's a very interesting way that we look at things, at least in terms of software companies I see. Everybody's thinking about different pricing models now.
Comments on open source, or maybe Larry's first comment?
One thing that I want to mention is that the open source tools that are available, I mean, we certainly use them in our development shop, but recently I've seen some big enterprise companies in software licenses ask for additional legal protection from lawsuits against, and for us to certify and certify for IP infringement against this. So
wait, I'm sorry. They're asking you?
Us to certify that if we are using open source software, which one is it, and to protect them from any infringement lawsuits. And that is maybe an offshoot of SEO and all that stuff that's going on. And it's very difficult for us because what they start doing is they start raising the infringement liabilities from $1 million or the cost of the software to $10 million, which is really hard for a early stage startup to do. So that's the one thing that I see. I mean, we're able to get around it and come up with some language, but it's rearing its ugly head, and especially with the Fortune 500 companies.
If I could just jump in, I'd like to let people know one thing. A lot of people may not be aware of this, but the Open Source Development Lab, which I'm on the board of directors, has put together a $10 million legal defense fund specifically to defend end users who may be involved in legal action or afraid of that, right? And frankly, we think it's mostly just we don't expect these things to show up, but it's there to provide a certain sense of security that you can share with customers to say, look, if something comes along, there is a very large entity with a lot of money that's sitting there backing that would help defend in some cases.
Samir, you want to say something about open source, or should we?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we're having the conversation. I probably want to amplify a little bit of what Larry said earlier. It's open source today versus maybe 18 or 24 months ago. It's just a fact of life. We don't even think at Sequoia Capital, for example, about investing in open source or behind a trend because we just take it for granted. It's in almost every company that we invest in some form or fashion, and it might be that it's embedded Linux in a systems company where you think this is a networking company, but they're leveraging some open source piece or component. Or it could be that it's a software company that now doesn't have to pay for an Oracle license or a BEA license if they're hosting their application because they can use JBoss or MySQL. So, I mean, I think it's just you have to incorporate the thinking of open source into whatever company you're designing today. And maybe the one example, I did want to leave one example because there's so many different ways open source can get used. So I'm an investor in a company called SourceFire, which is a security appliance company. And it turns out that the founder of that company wrote one of the most popular open source programs out there, something called Snort, which is an open source IDS. And you think, okay, well, Snort is something you download for free, and it's the typical open source, sort of has the open source myth around it or mantra around it. But the whole company of SourceFire was started around the fact that, Snort has an incredible user base of people that download it, but ultimately, from a security standpoint, when people want to buy something for the enterprise or for government applications or whatever, they're not going to use an open source product that's not supported, or they're not going to do something that doesn't come from a commercial vendor. So the open source strategy within SourceFire was really something about seeding accounts, and it was really more from it's a sales and distribution strategy. It isn't anything about developing technology. They don't put anything out there that they expect to get back in terms of code written. All the code is owned by the company, and it's just put out in the public domain for people to start playing with. So, I mean, there's so many clever ways you can use it, right, versus what some of the common assumptions are. And anybody that's thinking about starting a company now just has to understand that this is, like a few years ago when you thought, okay, client server's happening or whatever, now web is happening, open source is just there. It's just got to be something you factor in.
Yeah, I think the key word here is open, not so much source. And you're seeing some of the companies like Salesforce released a product called S-Force, which is a toolkit to build on top of its product, and that toolkit is free. At Voltage, a company that's just down the hall talking about their company creation, they have a toolkit for their product, which is free, so that you can actually build your own clients and your own add-ons to the product. So from the standpoint of not only company creation, but the standpoint from customers, the word open is really a key thing that needs to be part of the vernacular for this current year as well. I recently talked to a very, very large investment banking company that was going to buy IM software. And they had just come back from Microsoft. They were a Microsoft Exchange user, and I asked if they were going to buy Microsoft IM. And they said, no, we're getting Jabber, and we'd pay as much as they charge us for it because it is open. And we have some unique Unix clients laying around, and so we have to have a complete open toolkit to our IM system, and at this point in time, Microsoft doesn't provide that. So maybe one thing we need to add up there is not open source, but open.
Let's do it from the perspective of, I'm an entrepreneur. What am I supposed to make out of all this? Or usually that means I'm trying to make something happen. And so, how do you view what the changes in enterprise software in terms of opportunity?
Well, I could take up the rest of the half hour for this topic, but I'll keep it short. So what I found, so I'll actually compare. I'll compare the reactions we had when we were taking out the first Rubrik enterprise marketing automation product, and then with RubiconSoft, the challenges that we face. And actually just, and that tells you a lot about the enterprise software market. So at Rubrik, we went out and we, contacted General Motors and Cisco and Hewlett-Packard and talked to them about the internet and using the internet for marketing and interacting with their customers and all of the different things they could do. And, within I think slightly long, 4 to 6 months, because we didn't have a product, we had an HTML prototype. All three of those companies bought our product and started to implement it, enterprise-wide. And I didn't really have to go talk to John Chambers about using my software. I talked to the director of marketing and the VP of marketing at Cisco, mostly the director level person. So, and we thought that was really tough. We said, wow, we're a startup. We've raised $6-7 million so far, and these people are taking us through the ringer in terms of due diligence. So cut to 2003 and 2004. So in our early forays into the marketplace, I believe with demand visibility, we're solving a much more strategic problem. We're going to the same companies that saw demand fall off a cliff and didn't see it coming, that wrote off $2.8 billion in inventory at the high end, hundreds of millions of dollars for every one of these companies, mid-size or large companies. And the thing that we heard was, we're not buying software from startups. In fact, we're not buying software at all. So there was a huge, block, basically, to even talk. People were willing to talk about the strategic problem, but the CIO, the corporate budgets, the downsizing, that led to tremendous pressures not to buy additional software, but try to use software from existing vendors. And the only reason they weren't doing that, and this gets back to the pricing point, was the cost of customization and the software models were so high that companies wouldn't even venture into these initiatives. So as a software company, we said, okay, great. So not only do people don't want to spend any money, but they don't want to spend it with startups, and they don't want to spend a whole lot of money when they do decide to do it. So how do we make all of this work? And so I think we've had to examine the kind of value that we provide. So what we indeed started to do was an exercise that I call chunking. So what we found out was companies had a tolerance for high value, very clear ROI articulated, good alignment with the role or function, and wanted to spend, less than $500,000, including implementation, and that's for the initial buy. And that's sort of what we had to fit our software to it. Behind the scenes, we had to, sort of do a lot of work in sort of vectoring the features of the product around a specific problem. So it's definitely tougher. It encourages you to be very, very clear in the ROI that you have and to produce it for companies. And literally every single company that bought our product, they had no choice. They had no other choice. They explored every choice available, and then they couldn't do it with any other software, so they bought ours. So the bar is really high. You have to be very competitive, and you have to solve a real problem. So let me give you an example of what that problem might be that companies would spend money for. So this is a Fortune 50 company, and basically our users signed up for $30 million of additional margin improvement per year by doing the following things: by really tweaking their product mix, by analyzing what they were selling versus what they thought they would sell, over 15,500 options on base units, different configurations to look for profit pools, high margin products that weren't moving maybe fast enough in a channel, and then what to do about it. Use levers like pricing. Very complex problem to solve, and we were the only ones who could solve it, so they proceeded down the path with us. So that's the kind of tough, hard ROI sell that you have to make.
So, let's talk about software. Social networking. Here we are networking today, and a lot of us network online.
So
why are you doing this right now?
Why am I doing this? That's a good question. I mean, the first question I think you have to ask is, what is social networking? And I myself am pretty confused about that. And I kind of was reminded of something when we talked about open source. A few years ago, I was involved in a venture-backed software startup, and I remember the CEO of the company thought, we should do something with open source. Open source, open source. Open source is hot. I came back from conference, people talking about open source. We should do something. And I was like, hold on. What are you talking about? Do you want us to, let people outside of our company be involved in the development of the product? Do you want to give part of it away for free and then charge for another part? Or are you just talking about open standards like Ann was talking about? I mean, what are you talking about? And he was just like, open source, And the funny thing was, right now, I think, as some of the panelists have alluded to, like if you're like Friendster and you're using Tomcat and ModPHP and Apache and MySQL and Linux, this is nothing that interesting. This is pretty standard stuff in Silicon Valley. But back then, this company, like Anu said, in some cases still, and this was a couple years ago, was not actually comfortable with that. So we were actually using expensive software from BA and Oracle and Veritas and stuff like that. So we were actually not using, that company was not using it themselves. But the CEO still was like, we need to do something with open source. And it was, what did that mean? And that kind of is similar to some of the way it sounds like people are talking about social networking today. And if somebody came to one of the VCs on the panel and say, I want to start an open source software company that just is, you're not using open source or not has open source is just one thing that's part of how they're doing their business, but it's an open source company, they'd probably think the person was crazy. But it seems like that's kind of where we're at with social networking. And I've been joking with my friends that I'm going to start a social networking venture fund that will invest in nothing but social networking companies.
That's a good idea.
So when I started Friendster, I was aware of a couple websites that were for business or professional networking, and now there's even more of them, and I bet probably everybody in the room is on probably two of them. And when I said social networking, I meant this is not going to be a business or professional networking service where I'm supposed to be able to figure out how somebody can introduce me to Samir. This is just something for social stuff like friends and dating and, not business, something that's appealing to just a very wide audience. And that's what I meant by the term. And since then, it's taken on pretty other meanings in more than one. So sometimes people are talking about social networking, and it seems like they're talking about basically companies, services, or sites that are very similar to Friendster. Sometimes, obviously, very derivative of Friendster, but sometimes it's discussed much more broadly. And you'll read an article, and they'll talk about social networking, and they'll be talking about Match.com and Classmates and Monster and Rise or Meetup, Craigslist, and and it seems like they're talking about anything to do with community or communications on the internet. So, and that is also illustrative of how problematic it is when people are not even talking about the same thing. And it kind of reminds me of when people were all abuzz over push technology or peer-to-peer or things like that. So I think that the concepts of how people are connected together is obviously a very powerful one. And we at Friendster think we're building a really interesting platform for consumer internet services. And there are other companies like, for example, Spoke that is doing something in enterprise that also has some conceptual similarities. They also are interested in how people are connected to each other. But they're two very different companies with different business models in really different markets, doing in many ways very different things. So we think that there are really interesting elements to what we're doing that within the context of a specific application or market are really powerful. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a trend or industry of social networking, whatever that means. So it's kind of gotten so much overhyped that I myself am now kind of confused about what it all means.
Are anybody investing in social networking companies?
Well, we would have loved to have been an investor in Friendster, but there was quite a line at the door, and we didn't quite get there in time. This is it's great to draw the analogy to open source because this is exactly the same thing here. I mean, people talk about social networking, but the way I think about it, or some of the way we think about it, is it's, the right way to think about this is about a market or an application that makes sense online, where there's some utility to the networking model or building a network or a trusted or personal, set of connections. And, the application could be dating, it could be recruiting, it could be, you can think about 20 or 30 other things where that sort of application makes sense. And by the way, we know these make sense because there's all kinds of companies out there that aren't using some sort of a network model that are incredibly successful in these markets or application areas. I mean, there's probably, if you add up recruiting and dating alone, there's $1 billion spent online or more. So, I think it's more of a question of where some sort of a trusted network can have applicability. And we end up making an investment in a company that we think, it's not at all competitive. They would both be social networking companies by a lot of people's definitions, but, I would use, the company we're investors in is called LinkedIn, and I might use LinkedIn because it's something that's useful for recruiting or making developing a business relationship or making a connection with somebody. We could very simply also have an account at Friendster and use that for all sorts of personal reasons. So, it's sort of slice it a different way, and you realize that there's probably a more sensible approach to the definition in the market rather than just saying social networking.
I just have to ask, though, how many people get an email from somebody regarding LinkedIn that you actually know them? Oh, that's great. I haven't got one yet.
That's good.
I never know the people sending them to me.
I'll send you one.
Okay. Please.
Tom, I'll tell you one of the big LinkedIn tips I got the other day, and Samir, you probably need to know this since you're the investor. Two of my portfolio companies said that they don't go on Google to find anyone anymore, that Stu Alsop has dumped in the largest contact database into LinkedIn, which includes the entire history, I assume, of NEA. So they just go to Stu Alsop's LinkedIn account on LinkedIn to find anybody.
Social networking.
That's right. He is he will be the Oscar winner this year on LinkedIn.
Oh, that's great.
One of the issues one of the observations I have, first of all, I use LinkedIn. I get lots of invitations, and I sign up, and then it's kind of interesting to see how many degrees away somebody else is all that stuff. But in terms of business usefulness, and I'm talking about sort of business social networking, things like Spoke or whatever, one of the things that I don't like is when I get, and I don't know how to deal with it yet, and maybe the application developers will figure something out. I get this invitation from somebody I don't know, through somebody I do know, to introduce them to someone else that I don't know. And that's like...
You're a big Spoke user.
Yeah, I know. I'm actually, I try them all. I'm part of this experiment. So then it's like, so what is the etiquette for dealing with this? And I think it's usually the delete button.
Well,
the funny thing about those
is an ignore button now, which is a little more polite.
I've learned that you actually I'm a big networker. That's why I started the company. And there's many people in this room that I know, and I could probably think back and figure out, okay, I knew this person who introduced me to that person, this VC to that entrepreneur, and But you usually go one step at a time. And some of these sites where they're trying to traverse 4-degree jump at one time, it actually is a little challenging. But what I think is interesting about all this in terms of the trends we put up on the board, when I talked about cost and connectedness, is one of the reasons that people are excited about Friendster and trying to copy it and think that there's something interesting there is the way we've been able to grow very quickly at low cost by building up a big user base. And essentially, people call it viral marketing. With Friendster, it's kind of, we've taken it to another level. I call it viral nagging, where your friends actually bug you, and why aren't you on Friendster yet? Put up a photo and all this kind of stuff, and it's taken it a whole other level. But we, unlike say Match.com, are not spending millions of dollars on marketing, so the user acquisition cost is low, and that addresses one of the cost factors. And we couldn't do what we're doing if it wasn't for the connectedness and looking at an application in the context of the internet. And really, using the fact that people are connected together. And the vision of Friendster really is that people are all using the internet, and people are connected together in real life. And most internet sites, you use Google and Amazon and eBay and your friends do, but nothing's really done with the fact that there's a human connection between these different people all using these same sites. And that's where our vision comes in. Match.com and the traditional dating sites that preceding Friendster, they really, if you look at it, there wasn't really that much they were doing that couldn't be done with personal ads in the newspaper. You just took it and you put it on a computer screen. But the idea of actually figuring out how people are all connected together, that really couldn't have been done before without this internet medium as a platform. So it's a cost, it's something we're doing where we're having a cost savings, and we're really, the enabler of that is the network. And it's the same thing with open source. Back in the 80s, people had public domain software. There were people who wanted to write software for free, but, this was downloading off of bulletin board BBSs with, 300 baud modems. Without the internet, there wasn't really the platform for the same collaboration community that we have today. And of course, one of the reasons we do like open source, in addition to the openness, is the cost saving. And it's also true of the other big trend in software right now, outsourcing. Cost reduction is obviously one of the reasons people are interested in this, and the internet and the ability to to have that network and going back between here and India or whatever, that's the enabler. So I think that everything people are doing, whether it's outsourcing or ASPs or open source or viral marketing, there's a big interest in reducing costs, and it's all being enabled by network effects. And looking at things and remembering this is the internet age now. If anything you're doing is not networked, it's kind of cuckoo, and that's what Microsoft is now trying to do with Longhorn. They're trying to basically completely make networking, communication, community collaboration like part of the operating system now, because they realize that that's where it's going.
Since you used the word outsourcing, let's talk a little bit about that, because I know you were talking about it in terms of cost. So it's really interesting to see our industry. Or the software industry becomes so political. I mean, this year, It is a political hot button. They didn't make it on the cover just for the heck of it. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why it's here, because it says it's very, it's trying to create a little bit of controversy. Will outsourcing hurt America's supremacy? And the politicians on both sides of the aisle are, using it in their speeches. So. What do you think of that? What's an entrepreneur supposed to think about all this, this
So I'm
going on?
actually dealing with that, right now, because as I mentioned to you, these large companies, want to pay less for more software that's harder to build, okay? And if you look at it, the economics don't work. And you have to figure out a way. And, of course, we still have multiple databases, multiple app servers, multiple platforms out there. So you have to support those and so on and so forth. So, it's kind of, interesting, because if you want to, you used to get a couple million for your software, now you're going to get 500,000, and it's going to take you a little bit longer to sell, and it's got to be better. How can you possibly, have an infrastructure to support all that? Now, as a startup, here's where we're a little bit different from the larger companies, which is we need to keep our innovation here near the customers, and our customers are here. So what we've done is, actually I undertook a trip to India in December, not too far away, and I selected some outsourcing potential partners, and I flew into the city of Bangalore and went to the best, hotel there, and decided that I would go down to the coffee shop and get a cup of coffee. And as I walked to the seafood buffet, I had 3 people from Palo Alto say, "Hi, Anu, what are you doing here?" Okay, they were all VPs of engineering of different software companies in the Valley. I had no idea that they were outsourcing in Bangalore. So, it's kind of a tough thing. The choice we've made, we selected them, and it's wonderful to see, how easy it's been made for us. Such as those, the people, the rates, the facilities. The way you can outsource the product, it's almost like how manufacturing went overseas. So as an entrepreneur, I just don't think that we can afford to ignore it.
Yeah. What do you advise in your companies or seeing in your companies?
It's very rare that a startup is not using some resources. Most often in India, there's not a language issue, as you said, Anu. It's cookie cutter how to set up a subsidiary there, and it's not really about cost. It's about availability of engineers. I mean, even though Tom can talk quite fast. He's not graduating enough engineers. They're graduating more engineers in India than we are here, and China will graduate more than India. And so we have a higher bar, not just in delivering higher quality at lower costs, but it's a competitive world in software. And to have 24/7 innovation, to have really high caliber engineers, and the pricing between the costs of the best engineers in India and the best engineers here, the gap is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So it is not about cost. It's not like we're Dell Computing and outsourcing our call centers to India. We're looking for the best engineers we can find anywhere we can find them, and we have job openings in every single one of our startups for individual contributor engineers, architects. There's just not enough of them graduating here. I think Greenspan gave a talk just the other day, and he was really one of the first person in a political forum to say this is about education, not about jobs. And it's a very competitive landscape. Software is. It is not about financial capital. It's about intellectual capital. And so we have to find that intellectual capital wherever we can. And because India has become so sophisticated and there's not a language issue, they've made it easy for us to have an unfair competitive advantage as a software industry to get started early with engineers around the world and have in place local markets. China is coming up very, very fast in that regard as well. So I think it's part of the fabric of not just big software companies, but of right at the starting line software companies to really have global operations in engineering.
Yeah.
You have a comment?
I want to just jump in. Global engineering, global software development is a fact of life. And VA makes a product, SourceForge, which is designed to exactly do this. I spent a lot of time thinking about this space. The product itself is built in a split engineering team. There's a core engineering team that's in Fremont, and then there's a remote engineering team that includes people in Bangalore and in Eastern Europe. And it's just, we have up on the wall, we've got this set of clocks, right, that go around the world because that's the way the development is moving around the world, and people follow it, right? So I think that's a way of life. And every company building software is going to have a global software development team at some, eventually, right? But within that context, I do want to say that I think as a company you have to decide what is your core competency, right? And you don't outsource your core competency. So if a piece of technology is core to your company and core to your business, you're not going to outsource that, right? But if you're looking at a product and, it runs on Oracle and MySQL and PostgreSQL, and now the nth customer's come along and said, it's got to run on DB2 and we'll pay you to do that, that probably isn't your core competency, right? And that's a place for outsourcing. So global development, but know where your core competency is and keep that close. And I don't think you'll see that outsourced.
Comment?
First of all, I agree with what the others have said. I would sort of emphasize it and summarize it by saying that any new software company that gets started, if you don't have some sort of outsourcing or offshore strategy, I think you will be at a fundamental competitive disadvantage going forward. I think you have to have an approach that takes advantage of the labor and talent pool that exists in other parts of the world, India, China, Eastern Europe, whatever it might be. And I think the second thing is we've got to be careful about the distinction between two terms. There's outsourcing and there's offshoring. And I think it's very possible for early companies to maintain control over their intellectual property and take advantage of talent pools that exist abroad by essentially having that IP exist in their company. It just happens to be in a global development center that's somewhere else. It's not in Silicon Valley. I would be very concerned, like Larry said, about outsourcing, i.e. using a vendor or something like that for something that's really core to the company. The other issue that comes up with all this is, what does this mean? It's the political issue, right? And, we've seen this one before, right? This has happened in every other industry over the past 20 years. I mean, it happened in textiles. It happened in semiconductor manufacturing. It happened in contract manufacturing. This is no different than any of those other things. I think ultimately it's going to make any U.S. company more competitive to have if they take advantage of this capability. And if they don't, then they are going to be uncompetitive going forward in the global marketplace. When you think about it, Intel, right? People said, hey, look, here come, Korean semiconductor companies, Japanese semiconductor companies, Chinese semiconductor companies, but a fair amount of the intellectual property developed in the microprocessor business resides in the U.S. still. So I think there's ways to say that U.S. competitiveness does not get diminished because a certain class of skills or jobs or whatever are being moved offshore. It's just a fact of life. It's happened in other industries before.
Well, so before we open it up, thank you. Before we open it up to questions, I want to talk about one little area. And software. Once we broaden this topic today, of course, we walked in into dangerous ground because there's a lot to cover. But we have to talk about security because as I turned around to look at how we did, and I saw your comments, communication and collaboration and open, and we want all our data all the time, everywhere we are. And as Eric talked about, soon we will be able to do that with the petabytes. I don't know if you've thought about petabytes before. What about security in that world? And I'm talking software security. So, are you anybody can share their opinions? Are you investing? How are you investing, or how are your friends starting companies, or what? Well, I know you have one next door.
Well, unfortunately, I'm competing a little bit with Voltage Security, which was started here at Stanford and doing very well, which replaces the old PKI infrastructure for security of business communications. But for the enterprise, the drivers are pretty simple. If you're a financial services company, you have a regulation called GLB. If you're a healthcare company, you have HIPAA. If you are a public company, you have Sarbanes-Oxley. You also have the entire IT infrastructure was changed by the Internet and all of the enterprise communications. Not only do you have a lot of data, but your data is moving everywhere, and there's data on everything down to the sensor level. So if you're Sarbanes-Oxley and anything that touches your ERP system or your general ledger has to be certified as being secure. And security was one of those things that, hey, we had some defense perimeters and we had a bunch of software and appliances to do that. So our whole systems didn't go down. But we really didn't think about security at every level of the software stack. How about voice over IP? Is that secure? No. The SIP stack is only a few lines of code to begin with. So we really have quite a green field here driven by regulations of the U.S. government. We also have just the issues of the Internet becoming extremely polluted with things like spam. We also have the capability that with all that data we have to restore everything up to the record level, and we never thought about doing that before. Basically, the standard in storage is tape backup. And that's what some of the strongest companies in the Valley in storage are based on. So it does suggest that even though security sounds like it is overfunded, there still is a lot of new innovation needed there to actually totally secure the applications, the various pieces of the software stack, not just to defend, but be proactive to restore systems completely and to step up to these regulations. Most of these regulations are just starting to become in effect. HIPAA has just come into effect. Some of the compliance, SAS 70, 404 with Sarbanes are, for some of the companies, are about a year from today. GLB is real for the financial services company. If you use instant messaging to conduct a trade today, you're basically violating securities laws. So it is still a very wide open field, and basically our systems are fairly unsecure, penetrable, and pollution is available. The spam problem was one of the biggest, was more discussed at the World Economic Forum in Davos than world peace.
Which says a lot.
About world peace?
About world peace. Wow. Comments about security before we do Q&A?
I think security remains a big problem, big opportunity. I don't think it's overfunded because I suspect that most of the solutions truly needed haven't even been invented yet by any of the current companies. We're moving inevitably to a point where There's going to be, metropolitan wireless wide area networks with WiMAX. Every phone's going to be a smartphone and camera phone. Everybody's going to have servers, digital media servers at their house with all sorts of stuff on it, and will all be connected. Every enterprise is going to be having web services, integration stuff going on outside the enterprise. I mean, just every aspect, both personal. All your devices at home will be wireless enabled. Everything on both, business and personal. The risks are staggering, and it's going to, there are going to be many painful adjustments periods and learning periods, and there's going to be all sorts of huge security disasters inevitably. And I think we're going to need completely different models of addressing these security problems going forward.
We're in the first couple innings of a long ball game in security. There's only $2 billion markets, AV and firewall, right? There's all these other problems that need to be addressed. That's the good news for security, right? It's a young, vibrant, huge market opportunity. The bad news from a venture standpoint is there's about 800 private companies out there, and that's really the number. And it's pretty tough to sift through all of that, but it doesn't diminish from the fact that if you launch a company in the right spot with the right team, there is a lot of running room in this space. We've been active investors in security, even given that dynamic in terms of the private company activity over the past several years.
Yeah.
The good news is most of those 800 companies are probably not going to come up with a new model of some of the new solutions. It's just inevitable. So it's going to come up with something completely different that nobody at those companies would have let themselves think of.
I agree with that. The challenge always is that with 800 companies, most of them venture finance, it creates a lot of noise and confusion for people that are prospective buyers of the products. So the signal to noise ratio in the security market is higher than almost anywhere else. Maybe storage is the only one that's comparable.
There may be 800 companies that are funded, but I think there's another 800 that are not funded. Some of them are working on really cool stuff. And I recently met, just a couple of days ago, a guy who's working on, something called mobile secure, which is, when you actually start to move your computers and take it home and all these connections and sort of monitoring and making sure your documents are still secure even though you're mobile. And I thought that was pretty interesting. I hadn't heard that angle too much before.
Well, I think they're really hard problems. If you look at voltage security, the mathematics that they solve, that mathematical problem, which RSA was unable to solve, had been worked on for 17 years until Dr. Bonet here at Stanford University cracked that code. So I don't think it's a matter of whipping up an application. They really are hard problems, and they have huge returns and huge needs for corporations, as you mentioned earlier. I mean, the downside here is staggeringly scary. So the upside has high return.
There are applications even of some of the concepts in Friendster to security that are outside the scope probably of my business that I haven't heard anybody thinking about. And if you look at the internet and everything, not just as a end-to-end, everybody's connected kind of mess, but kind of a graph, whether you're looking at it spam or access control or security or things, and you're kind of saying everybody kind of has to be connected to anything through other people, and how does that work? And you kind of can define trusted versus non-trusted, and also the concept of blame, so that you can kind of pinpoint areas and block out, not just one, but whole areas of problems, whether it's access or denial of service or anything like that. There are really staggering implications of that could help address these problems a lot, and I haven't heard anybody really thinking along those lines.
Yeah, we don't even have a standard for single sign-on, in major corporations. I mean, small things are unsolved. Yeah. So it just is a testimony to how differently the enterprise and even the consumer, the digital lifestyle is today than it was 2 to 3 years ago, and how it has created new opportunities for lots of new companies.
I feel like I've been drinking from a fire hose, don't you? This is terrific. We could talk about security the rest of the afternoon. Larry, did you have something?
Oh, well, I was just going to jump in and say that while there are plenty of opportunities and hard problems that need to be solved by separate companies, I think security is one of those things, like open source, that needs to be in your architecture and thought about from the beginning, right? So if you've got a software product, you have to think about your security architecture underneath as a core part of the product. You can't rely on other pieces of the network to deliver it for you.
Yeah,
that's just important.
So what I've found is that, again, back to high value, specific, tough problem to solve, very clear ROI, priced low. Okay, those are the niche enterprise software areas that I see doing really, really well. Now, there's an area, and let's just talk about this. CRM, this whole area of CRM software was all about, knowing your customer and managing the interaction with the customer. And supply chain software and ERP software is a backbone infrastructure. It's about fulfilling the demand for the customer, managing interactions with suppliers. So what I found one of the few white spaces was the area of how to translate knowledge of the customer into optimum fulfillment. Totally being done in spreadsheets, wide open area, and was one of the few interesting white spaces in enterprise software that I found. There are other areas that are kind of interesting. Hosted CRM and all the related activity to hosted CRM still remains to be done. So somebody could move in, I think, and do some. I think there's an opportunity there as well. I'll give you an example of other very, the kind that meet the criteria I talked about before. There's a company called Calidus that went public. They do sales compensation management. Do you know this is a huge multi-dimensional problem? All of the quotas, the territories, the products, the discounts, the promos. People go crazy. No accounting systems out of the box are able to handle this problem. So, sales compensation management, hot. Okay, there's 2-3 companies in it. Companies going public. Calidus, I think, just announced the result. Did $22 million in sales for the fourth quarter. I think they're doing really well. Third is business intelligence. It's a lot of data that we've talked about. That's all over the enterprise. And being able to turn that into information and serve it to someone who can make some action or do something good with it. So an example being, if you were aware as a salesperson at a call center desk, exactly what pricing was running with discount, were you meeting margin targets, if you could analyze your deal and analyze the profit of every deal before you precisely priced it, you could actually pick up some margin points for that sale. And so doing that, which is called price execution, I think that's being adopted. So everywhere you go, the companies in enterprise software that are making it have had to become so good and targeted that they're not only doing well, they're doing very well. And so those are the areas to look at.
The thing that's interesting to me is that this thing, for the first time, here's the change that's happened in the last 10 years. So I graduated in 1994 from Stanford, and that space above Arbuckle was a bank of payphone booths, and no one in my class, except for one guy, owned one of these. And we always wondered who he was talking to when he was talking on his cell phone. So think about the massive change. Probably all of you have cell phones. All of you are walking around with wireless laptops. There's no payphone bank over on top of Arbuckle anymore. And the inflection point that we're at now is that this thing is, for the first time, a computer. You can download applications. They run Java or Brew. They're color screens. They're always on. They're networked. And there's going to be 400 million of these shipped at some point in the near future. Compare that to 100 million PCs a year that get shipped. That is a massive new opportunity for software, services, and content that doesn't exist today. It didn't exist a couple of years ago. And for people that think you're just going to repurpose all the old stuff on this new platform, that's not true. Every time a new platform has come out, there's always been a new company or set of companies that have been launched to take advantage of that platform. So I think this is the interesting consumer thing, one of them anyway, that is in front of us going forward.
Yeah, if you look at, the penetration of broadband, which is now more than critical mass, and the extraordinary drop in the cost of storage. I mean, how much storage you have in one of these devices. Also, you can see that a few companies have thrown grenades into a couple markets. I think Apple certainly threw a grenade into the entertainment thing by changing what was the razor and what was the blade. But also, if you even take your cable modem, by the end of the year, if you have a cable modem, probably in this area code, you'll be able to unplug your phone system and have Comcast be your phone company. And pretty soon you'll have a IP phone system, broadband. That's a lot of computing power in your home and really does make more available to this ever-connected universe. I think also what Samir is saying is we can't think of it as a single device. We have to think about it as the network. Back to this thing about communication and collaboration, the ability to actually bring a lot of these techniques we talked about, me being able to personalize my content to get what I want to talk to my group of constituents, is going to drive a lot of new applications. More important in between the enterprise and the consumer is small business. And small and medium businesses have turned out to be a kicker in this market. They couldn't afford this stuff before. So on-demand computing, the ability to just plug in to very robust applications and very robust services, have broadband delivery themselves, really makes that market much more vibrant than it was before. It was really a very, very tough market. That's the Fortune million. I think Samir mentioned it earlier. So we do really have three distinct markets: the consumer market, the enterprise market, and the small and medium business market, pretty much firing on strong cylinders simultaneously, which should really make Silicon Valley Mesopotamia for software companies once again.
Well, I'm so sorry. I have to wrap it up. Software is back, and we're so lucky here at Stanford to have people like this panel come over and over again, daytime, weekends like this, to come and help educate our students and our friends in the community. So join me in thanking them once again.